Princess of Wales pledged herself to serve her country and her people, and to maintain the precious principles of constitutional government which lie at the heart of our nation.
The decision was not softened by ceremony, delayed by discussion, or buried beneath palace language. It came down to a signature. King Charles had formally removed Camilla from the private Sandringham wing she had expected to remain within her royal orbit, and transferred the residence directly to Catherine. One stroke of a pen altered more than living arrangements. It redrew the emotional map of the family. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles knew the order would be read as more than a change of rooms. Sandringham was not simply another royal property. It was the private Norfolk estate where generations gathered at Christmas, where succession, memory, and personal standing had long been felt behind closed doors. A residence order, in plain terms, was the king's written instruction deciding who could use a particular part of that private estate. This one removed Camilla's access to a designated wing and assigned the residence to Catherine instead. Camilla read the crucial line twice. She sat alone in a sitting room, holding the paper still, as disbelief hardened into anger. The queen consort had expected disagreement, perhaps even restrictions, but not a clean removal from a place she considered part of her settled royal life. She lowered the page without speaking. For several seconds, only her hand tightened against the document. Charles felt the weight of the decision differently. After signing, he closed the folder, removed his glasses, and stayed silent at the desk. The king did not ask for revisions. He did not soften the wording. Instead, he placed the signed order beneath his palm and told an aide, "Issue it exactly as written." The transfer took effect immediately, leaving no delay in which objections could grow into another private negotiation. Catherine's name made the decision even more explosive. She had not asked for the rooms. She had not pressed Charles to remove Camilla, and she had not demanded a new residence at Sandringham. Yet the monarch had chosen her anyway. That detail changed the emotional meaning of the order. This was no longer merely about accommodation. It looked like a message about trust, succession, and who Charles believed should stand closer to the monarchy's future. Camilla understood that too, and the realization cut deeper than the loss of any room. Catherine had gained something she never requested, while she had lost something she believed was secure. The signature explained what happened, but to understand why it cut so deeply, the story had to move away from the document and into the three people whose relationships had now been permanently altered. For Camilla, the loss was humiliating. For Catherine, the gift was uncomfortable. And for Charles, the decision carried the unmistakable cruelty of choosing between two women who occupied very different places in his private and royal life. Sandringham had suddenly become the physical symbol of a deeper conflict, one in which affection, duty, succession, and resentment could no longer remain politely separated. Camilla felt the wound because that wing had represented something far greater than comfort. To her, it had been proof that after years of scrutiny and uncertainty, she finally belonged permanently inside the king's world. Sandringham carried private family meaning, as well as royal weight, and losing space there felt like losing standing. When she confronted Charles privately, her voice stayed controlled until one sentence broke through everything else. "You are managing me rather than being married to me." The accusation landed harder than anger, because the queen consort was no longer talking about rooms. She was questioning what their marriage meant when duty and succession entered the room. Charles did not answer quickly. He understood that Catherine's position carried a very different kind of importance. She stood beside William, the future king, and any expanded role given to her at Sandringham strengthened the family's preparation for the next reign. In simple terms, succession meant the planned passing of the crown, and its responsibilities from one monarch to the next. The king believed the estate had to reflect that future, even if the change wounded someone standing beside him in the present. Catherine felt none of the triumph others might have expected. She stood beside a table holding the residence papers but did not touch them. When William entered, he studied her expression before quietly saying, "You didn't ask for this." She looked at him and answered, "No." The prince immediately understood the significance. His father had acted without pressure from Catherine, which meant Charles had reached his own conclusion about Camilla and the future structure of Sandringham. Catherine finally asked the question troubling her most. Would this look like deliberate humiliation? Charles refused to reverse the order. Instead, he told her the decision concerned stability. The word was simple, but its meaning was heavy. The monarch was not merely reallocating bedrooms. He was deciding which relationships, responsibilities, and future roles should be anchored most firmly inside one of the family's most symbolic private estates. William heard that explanation and became quieter. If his father had moved this decisively, then something serious had pushed him there. Charles had not awakened one morning and suddenly changed Sandringham. He had been reconsidering the arrangement for months, ever since one deeply uncomfortable family encounter forced him to look at the estate differently. And that simple answer shifted attention backward, to the private encounter at Sandringham that had transformed irritation into a decision Charles could no longer postpone. The breaking point did not begin with lawyers, property maps, or a royal order. It began during a family gathering at Sandringham, behind a closed door, after what should have been an ordinary discussion about future use of the estate. One conversation turned unexpectedly personal. By the time Charles walked away from it, the question was no longer who preferred which rooms. It was who understood where the monarchy was heading. Charles had already been reconsidering how the family's private residences would function, as William and Catherine took on greater responsibility. The change mattered because these homes were not only places to stay, they also reflected access, influence, and who was being prepared for the future. Camilla could feel that balance shifting. Each new arrangement favoring the Wales family seemed to her like another quiet reduction of the position she had fought years to secure beside the king. Camilla finally pushed back during a Christmas planning discussion. Catherine was being considered for a larger role in hosting family gatherings and coordinating future use of certain rooms, and the queen consort refused to hide her frustration. According to a private documented account of the meeting, she looked directly at Charles and said the estate should not be reorganized around the next reign while this one is still alive. The words landed with a force far greater than she intended. Charles did not raise his voice. That made the moment worse. The king slowly pushed his chair back, held her gaze for several seconds, and answered, "That is precisely the problem." He left without finishing his tea. Camilla remained behind, angry at first, then unsettled. She had expected resistance, perhaps even a sharp argument. Instead, his silence felt colder and far more final. Later that evening, Charles asked for the historic residence allocation papers. These were the internal records showing how different parts of the private estate had been assigned and used over time. He began studying exactly which spaces remained under his personal control. The monarch was no longer reacting emotionally. He was looking for a solution he could actually enforce. Anne soon learned about the dispute through a private conversation with her brother. She warned him that unclear boundaries would create larger problems as succession moved closer, especially if present loyalties and future responsibilities kept colliding. Charles listened carefully, because she was not asking him to choose Catherine over Camilla. She was telling him that indecision itself had become dangerous. That night changed the shape of everything. Camilla believed she had defended her place. Charles believed he had discovered why the old arrangement could no longer survive. Months later, the memory of that sentence would return with full force. because when Camilla finally confronted him over the signed transfer, neither of them could pretend the dispute was still about rooms. There was no courtier to absorb the tension, and no official statement to hide behind when Camilla finally faced Charles. She entered expecting an explanation, and received something far more painful: certainty. The conversation became the emotional center of the crisis, because for the first time, the Sandringham transfer was spoken about not as administration, but as a choice, and Camilla believed she knew exactly whom the king had chosen. Camilla had asked for the meeting the moment she learned the transfer could not be delayed. She wanted one thing from Charles: a sign that the decision was still open. Instead, the king came prepared to defend it. The household decision, the formal instruction controlling who could use the residence, had already moved beyond discussion. He had decided before she entered that he would not reopen it, and she sensed that certainty almost immediately. Camilla did not waste time. "You didn't move rooms, you chose her." The words struck at the deepest part of the conflict. To the Queen Consort, Catherine's new position at Sandringham was no longer just a practical change. It felt like a verdict on her own importance beside Charles. She had spent years believing her place had finally become secure. Now one signed order seemed to tell her that permanence had limits. Charles tried to separate emotion from duty. He told her the decision was about continuity, not affection. The king insisted that planning for the next reign did not erase the present one, but he stopped short of promising that her influence at Sandringham would remain untouched. That refusal hurt more than the explanation. Camilla wanted reassurance. He gave her structure. Then Charles revealed what made the transfer impossible to dismiss as temporary. The wing would become part of Catherine and William's future family base at the estate. The future king and his wife would not merely visit the space. It was being positioned as part of their long-term place within Sandringham. For Camilla, that changed everything. The rooms were not being borrowed. They were being reassigned with succession in mind. Camilla slowly removed a ring from one finger and turned it while he spoke. Charles then returned to the Christmas confrontation, telling her that the argument had convinced him competing claims could not be allowed to damage William's future reign. She placed both hands on the table. "Then at least say it plainly." Charles held her gaze. "The decision stands." Camilla rose, knowing she had lost the argument with him, but not yet believing every route was closed. If the king would not change his mind personally, perhaps the people and procedures surrounding the transfer could still slow it, weaken it, or reshape what it meant. But standing behind those 4 words was an entire structure of royal authority, and Camilla was about to discover just how completely Charles had secured the decision before telling her. Royal power is often most intimidating when nobody raises their voice. By the time Camilla searched for a way to challenge the Sandringham transfer, Charles had already ensured that the practical machinery around the decision was aligned. Household officials had instructions. Access schedules were being revised, and one crucial reality became impossible to ignore. This was not an emotional threat made during an argument. It was an executed decision. Charles had acted with the authority he believed the estate gave him. Sandringham was privately held by the monarch, rather than operating exactly like an occupied state palace, which meant the king controlled far more of its internal residential arrangements. Household offices then turned that authority into reality. They handled room assignments, staff access, maintenance, security, private schedules, and the daily use of family spaces. Once those offices moved, the transfer stopped being an idea and became something physical. Anne understood that danger immediately. She met Charles privately and studied the signed papers in silence before asking, "Is this necessary?" The Princess Royal was not questioning his right to act. She was questioning the emotional cost. She warned him that removing Camilla's place under the language of administration could look like punishment if he was not careful. The king listened, because his sister had rarely softened difficult truths for him. Charles admitted the decision had already hurt his marriage. He knew Camilla saw the transfer as a personal rejection, and he knew no technical explanation would erase that feeling. But the monarch insisted that indecision would cause greater damage. If competing claims at Sandringham were allowed to deepen, he believed William's future position and Catherine's growing responsibilities would become trapped inside the same family conflict. After a long pause, he looked at Anne and said, "Necessary things are rarely kind." Camilla soon discovered just how far the process had advanced. A revised household schedule already named Catherine's office as the coordinating point for the transferred wing. That meant practical questions about access and future use would no longer move through her. The Queen Consort had hoped she might still slow the decision through procedure. Instead, procedure had already moved ahead of her. Camilla felt the humiliation sharpen when she learned that several personal items had been scheduled for relocation before her challenge had even been fully heard. Staff had been given instructions. Timetables had been set. What she had imagined as a possible negotiation now looked almost impossible to reverse. Charles had built certainty into every layer of the order, and Anne could see what that certainty was costing him. Yet neither of them could stop what came next. Those words sounded theoretical until the next morning, when Camilla saw the first unmistakable sign that the Sandringham wing was no longer hers. The transfer became real, not when the signature dried, but when boxes appeared. Staff entered rooms Camilla had considered part of her private royal life, and began separating what would remain from what would leave. There are few humiliations more intimate than watching a place continue functioning after it has ceased to belong to you. And for Camilla, that morning turned palace politics into something painfully physical. Camilla arrived before anyone expected her. Several belongings had already been catalogued, private staff schedules were being changed, and keys were being reassigned under the new arrangement. Catherine's household had been given access for future planning, though she had not moved into the wing and had made no attempt to claim it personally. That made the atmosphere stranger still. The rooms were not yet Catherine's in any lived sense, but they were no longer Camilla's in the way they had been before. Camilla stopped when she saw an attendant lift a framed photograph from a side table. For a moment, she said nothing. Then the Queen Consort quietly told the attendant, "Leave that one." She dismissed the staff politely and waited until the door closed. Only then did she sit beside the untouched frame, staring at the room that was still familiar but no longer secure. Catherine felt no satisfaction when she was told the process had begun. She immediately asked that nothing unnecessary be removed in her name. The future queen understood why the transfer mattered for succession and family continuity, but she also understood what it looked like from the other side. Every object moved could be interpreted as another act of victory. Every empty shelf could deepen the humiliation. William saw the trap before she finished explaining it. The prince warned her that rejecting the wing outright could be read as defying Charles and reopening a decision his father had deliberately made final. Catherine could protect Camilla's dignity only so far, without challenging the king himself. That left her caught between compassion and duty, exactly where Charles's decision had placed her. Then one detail made the symbolism impossible to ignore. A long-used sitting room was specifically retained for Catherine's future use, rather than being returned to neutral family space. The choice suggested Charles wanted continuity to be seen and felt inside Sandringham, not merely written into a schedule. The transfer was becoming a statement. Catherine finally understood that officials could not repair what had happened. William could advise her, and Charles could defend the order, but neither could speak for the woman losing the space. That silence could not last, and Catherine knew the next conversation had to happen without Charles, advisors, or palace procedure standing between them. For days, every conversation had passed through someone else. Charles, William, aides, papers, schedules. Then Catherine removed the institutional buffer. She asked to see Camilla alone. No officials attended. No husband sat beside either woman. And in that private meeting, the conflict changed shape, because Catherine finally said the one thing Camilla had not expected to hear from the person receiving her Sandringham rooms. Catherine requested the conversation before making any personal change to the transferred wing. She understood that once furniture moved, rooms were altered, or family routines shifted, the transfer would feel even more final. Camilla agreed reluctantly. The Queen Consort expected either a carefully prepared apology or a polite explanation designed to make the loss easier to accept. She wanted neither. Catherine did not defend herself for long. She pushed the residence plan aside and said plainly, "I did not ask him to take it from you." The words separated her from Charles's decision without challenging his authority. That distinction mattered. She was not refusing the king's order, but she was making clear that she had never asked to gain influence through Camilla's loss. Camilla's anger softened, though it did not disappear. She admitted that Catherine's intentions were not the deepest wound. What hurt was realizing Charles no longer treated her wishes as decisive when planning the monarchy's future. The Queen Consort had believed marriage gave her a permanent voice beside him. Now she could see that succession had created limits around that influence. Catherine answered with something Camilla had not expected. She offered to preserve several personal features of the wing rather than immediately redesign everything around herself and William. The future queen made clear that accepting responsibility did not require erasing the woman who had lived there before her. The gesture did not reverse the transfer, but it lowered the emotional temperature. Camilla finally spoke about the Christmas argument, with less anger than before. She conceded that her confrontation with Charles had forced him into a choice he had been avoiding. Either allow resentment over the next reign to deepen, or settle the competing claims before they became permanent. She still believed the king had been harsh, but for the first time, she understood the logic he believed he was following. Catherine looked down at the untouched papers and said, "This should not be the thing that defines us." Camilla paused. "Then don't let it." Nothing had been restored. Nothing had been reversed. Yet the conflict had changed. Their private truce could soften the family wound, but it could not stop the outside world from turning Sandringham into the next great royal symbol. By morning, a private family decision had become national theater. The Sandringham transfer was no longer being interpreted through quiet conversations or closed doors. It was splashed across front pages, dissected by broadcasters, and treated as a visible sign of who was rising and who was being left behind. The palace could control the residents. It could not control what Britain believed the transfer represented. Camilla saw the coverage before anyone could shield her from it. Royal residences often become symbols in the public mind because they suggest rank, trust, family closeness, and future authority, even when the legal reality behind them is far more complicated. Palace communications tried to frame the change as continuity and future family use, rather than punishment. But the Queen Consort knew that careful wording could not compete with a headline built around humiliation. Camilla folded one newspaper in half, so Catherine's photograph disappeared from view. The word "evicted" had already been used in commentary, turning a private loss into something public and brutal. She placed the paper beside an untouched breakfast and walked away. The rooms had already been taken from her. Now the story around those rooms was being taken from her too. Catherine felt trapped by the same coverage for a different reason. Commentators cast her as the victor in a contest she had never wanted to enter. The future queen had tried to preserve dignity inside the family, yet the public version reduced everything to a simple rise and fall story. Her gain looked larger because Camilla's loss was being displayed beside it. Then one broadcaster gave the transfer a meaning that spread quickly. During a live discussion, the presenter called it the clearest physical sign yet of the monarchy reorganizing itself around the next reign. The phrase changed the argument. Sandringham was no longer only about Charles and his wife. It had become a succession story centered on Catherine, William, and the future. Outside the gates, the symbolism became impossible to miss. A small crowd gathered beneath television lights, while cameras turned toward a newspaper held above the barrier. Across the front page were the words, "Charles chooses the future. Catherine takes Sandringham wing." The image captured exactly what the palace had feared. One private decision had become a national verdict. Charles understood that silence would now leave others to define his motives. The king had wanted continuity, not revenge, but those two ideas were beginning to look dangerously similar from the outside. The headlines had declared winners and losers. But Charles still had one final chance to decide what the moment would actually mean inside his family. In the end, nobody truly won Sandringham. Catherine received the wing, but not without discomfort. Camilla lost it, but the deeper wound was realizing that love could no longer guarantee influence over the monarchy's future. And Charles secured the transition he wanted, at a personal cost he could not pretend away. The residence changed hands, but the real transfer was from one royal era to the next. Catherine accepted the responsibility, rather than resisting the king's final decision. The transfer remained fully in force, and there would be no return to the old arrangement. Camilla still had her marriage, her title, and other private spaces, but Sandringham now carried a different symbolic hierarchy. What had once felt like proof of her permanence had become a visible sign that the monarchy was arranging itself around the generation that would follow. Charles met Camilla privately once more. The king did not apologize for making the decision because he still believed it was necessary. But he did acknowledge what the process had done to her. He told the queen consort that duty had overtaken intimacy, and that the pain caused by that choice was something he could not dismiss simply because the order had been lawful or practical. She listened without interrupting. Camilla finally accepted that nothing would change. Her response was not surrender so much as weary recognition. She understood that the monarchy could not remain built around the needs of one marriage forever. Another generation was waiting, and whether she liked the timing or not, that future was already arriving. The loss still hurt, but the fight had reached its end. Catherine made one decision of her own. She refused to erase every trace of Camilla from the wing. One familiar room was left largely intact, not as a sign of shared control, but as an act of respect. The future queen understood that continuity did not have to mean conquest. She could inherit responsibility without turning another woman's pain into a victory. Charles later walked through the transferred rooms with Catherine and handed her the final key himself. She closed her fingers around it, but did not smile. The king told her plainly that the space was not a prize. It was a responsibility. That sentence finally defined the meaning behind everything he had done. Camilla passed the same corridor later, paused only briefly, then continued walking without turning back. There would be no reversal, no second signature, and no restoration of the old arrangement. Sandringham had become the place where Charles finally drew the boundary between his private loyalties and the future of the crown. And once that boundary was drawn, every member of the family understood that the next royal chapter had already begun. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.